Imagine stepping into a village more than 380 years ago, where councils are governed not by written laws, but by belts of wampum gestures and centuries of tradition. Who held the real power? And how did ordinary people participate in decisions that shaped their world? Today we explore the Iroquois Confederacy as never before. What would you do if you witnessed these councils firsthand? August 1636, Onondaga Territory, upstate New York, USA. The summer sun presses against the wooden walls of longhouses, smoke curling steadily from each hearth, and the air carries the rhythmic sounds of children playing and mallets striking stretched hides. Men move deliberately along the central paths, carrying bundles of tools, wampum belts, and provisions, while women balance water vessels on their hips, tending crops and observing the routines of the village. Along the horizon, a council assembly forms its order, and ritual signaling tensions over hunting grounds and territorial boundaries. Decisions made here will redraw maps, define borders, and leave a mark on history that generations will remember. We ask ourselves, where exactly are we, what day is this, and what critical events are unfolding before our eyes? By the summer of 1636, the territories of the Five Nations were already shaped by decades of political maneuvering, trade competition, and intertribal alliances. The Mohawk, Oneida, Onondaga, Cayuga, and Seneca peoples maintained settlements along the Mohawk River, the northern banks of the St. Lawrence River, and their tributaries areas now corresponding to modern upstate New York and parts of southern Ontario. These villages were not isolated. They were positioned along vital waterways that connected distant settlements, enabling trade communication and coordinated defense. The geography itself imposed strategic constraints. Rivers served as arteries for transport, but dense forests and marshlands slowed movement and concealed potential threats. Seasonal floods or droughts could compromise crops and force temporary relocations, amplifying tensions over land and resources. Politically, the Iroquois Confederacy had developed a sophisticated system of governance in which councils, wampum belts, and ceremonial protocols structured decision-making. However, the Confederacy was under constant pressure from neighboring nations, including the Algonquin and Huron, as well as the expanding presence of European traders and missionaries. These external actors introduced new dynamics. Access to firearms, trade goods, and diplomatic alliances altered the balance of power between villages and nations. Each council had to consider not only internal disputes, but also potential threats or opportunities created by these interactions. Missionaries such as Father Joseph de la Roche recorded the arrival of French and Dutch traders, noting that their goods, metal tools, beads, and cloth, were distributed strategically, often shifting influence toward villages that controlled access points along rivers. Economically, the Confederacy relied on a combination of subsistence agriculture, hunting, and inter-village trade. Corn, beans, and squash formed the staple diet, while furs, particularly beaver pelts, became valuable trade commodities with European partners. This created pressure points. Disputes over hunting grounds, resource access, and trade routes could escalate rapidly if ceremonial acknowledgement or council mediation failed. Seasonal migrations of hunters, warriors, and trade parties meant that borders between villages were fluid and contested, with customary rules governing use, but no rigid written boundaries. Each decision made in a council had immediate consequences for food distribution, resource allocation, and defense readiness, linking governance directly to survival. Socially, the Confederacy structure emphasized hierarchy, mentorship, and the transmission of knowledge. Elders guided youth in both domestic and martial skills, while women managed agricultural production and storage, ensuring the continuity of economic and social systems. Ceremonial practices, including the use of wampum belts and formal greetings, codified agreements and reinforced authority, but adherence varied between villages. Differences in local custom, combined with the pressures of seasonal change and external influence, created natural points of tension that could escalate into disputes, requiring council intervention. These tensions were visible to observers. Travelers noted the careful orchestration of movement, the positioning of individuals in assemblies, and the subtle cues of authority that signaled both cooperation and potential conflict. Disease and demographic changes also contributed to instability. European contact had introduced pathogens to which indigenous populations had no immunity. While the full impact of epidemics varied, missionaries' records indicate awareness of reduced village populations and temporary relocation patterns to avoid exposure. This demographic stress amplified competition for fertile land, hunting grounds, and communal resources. The Confederacy had to respond to these pressures through coordinated decisions, using councils to allocate labor, distribute food, and plan defensive measures in anticipation of both human and environmental threats. The combination of political maneuvering, economic pressure, social structure, and environmental stress created a landscape in which decisions at the council table had consequences far beyond a single village. Territorial disputes could redefine access to critical resources. Ceremonial confirmation could legitimize or invalidate agreements, and alliances with European traders or neighboring nations could alter the balance of power. In this context, Father de la Roche observed a confederacy simultaneously cohesive and fragile, a network of settlements where each action had immediate and tangible consequences, yet where adherence to protocol and tradition provided stability amidst uncertainty. At the same time, European encroachment introduced new variables. French and Dutch traders, often aligned with specific villages, influenced decisions through the distribution of trade goods and the provision of information. Villages that controlled river passages or portage routes gained advantages that could shift the local balance of power. Missionary presence, including instruction, religious ceremonies, and documentation, added another layer of observation and intervention. These factors meant that council deliberations were not purely internal affairs, but reflected an emergent geopolitical reality in which European interests intersected with indigenous governance. By considering the political, economic, and social currents simultaneously, the Confederacy's councils became arenas where disputes were not only resolved, but also where long-term strategy was enacted. Every discussion over land-use hunting rights or ceremonial precedents had implications for food security, diplomatic relations, and inter-village hierarchy. Seasonal patterns, access to waterways, and environmental conditions all intersected with these decisions, reinforcing the importance of protocol sequence and ceremonial observance. Missteps could destabilize an entire region, while successful resolutions maintained cohesion and continuity across multiple settlements. As we examine this historical moment, we must ask which forces were pushing the Confederacy toward conflict and where on the map did power shift. Observers like Father de la Roche recorded villages' councils and ceremonies, capturing a snapshot of a complex society in motion. Trade disease, environmental pressures, intertribal relations, and European influence created a patchwork of pressures that demanded constant negotiation. The balance between cooperation and rivalry, protocol and necessity, shaped the Confederacy's decisions and defined its resilience. In sum, the cracks in the map that Father de la Roche observed were not random. They were the product of intersecting pressures, political maneuvering among the five nations, economic dependencies on trade and subsistence resources, social obligations embedded in hierarchy and ceremonial practice, and external forces introduced by European traders and disease. Each of these factors produced immediate and measurable consequences for villages and individuals, forcing councils to act decisively. The Confederacy's ability to navigate these pressures demonstrates both the sophistication and fragility of its governance, setting the stage for the events and decisions that would unfold during the summer of 1636. At the center of this summer of 1636 stands a Mohawk scout, known among his people as Teonin-Hokarawin, a youth of 16 winters whose observations, movements, and familial ties would provide continuity and guidance to the community during the shifting tensions of that season. Born in a longhouse on the eastern bank of the Mohawk River, Teonin-Hokarawin was the son of a warrior of repute and a woman skilled in agricultural practice and craftwork. From a young age, he was taught the principles of observation, stealth, and reporting, accompanying his father on hunting expeditions and patrols along the river paths that connected Mohawk villages to Onondaga and Oneida's territories. His responsibilities were clear: to monitor the movements of both neighboring nations and European traders to ensure the safety of his village, and to communicate critical information to the elders and council when necessary. By 16, Teonin-Hokarawin had demonstrated a keen sense of spatial awareness and an understanding of seasonal cycles. He knew the patterns of the river, the trails through dense forests, and the locations of caches used for trade or food storage. His tools were simple but essential: a small carved bow with sinew string, a leather quiver containing arrows fletched with goose feathers, and a pouch for wampum beads used to relay messages or confirm the completion of assigned tasks. In the summer of 1636, these implements accompanied him daily, whether he was traversing narrow portage routes or moving quietly along the edge of cultivated fields to observe approaching visitors. Teonin-Hokarawin's role extended beyond mere observation. As a liaison for his village, he attended council meetings with the elders, noting not only the words spoken, but the sequence of gestures, the placement of wampum belts, and the responses of chiefs from other nations. His presence allowed younger warriors and scouts to understand the subtleties of communication hierarchy and ceremonial protocol. During the early days of August, he recorded in his mind the arrangement of benches in the Onondaga Council House, the steps by which visitors were received, and the rhythm of speech that indicated consensus or dissent. These details would later be relayed to elders in Mohawk settlements that could not be present at every meeting. The motivations of Teoninhokuarawan were both personal and communal. He sought recognition as a reliable scout, aspiring to follow in his father's footsteps, but he also carried the weight of responsibility for the safety and continuity of his extended family and village. Observers like Father de la Roche noted his attentiveness to council proceedings, the care with which he handled wampum belts, and the precision with which he moved between villages. These details, seemingly minor, represented the embodiment of trust placed upon him by his kin and his community. He feared miscommunication or misrepresentation of the council's decisions, understanding that a single error could escalate tensions over hunting grounds, trade routes, or ceremonial precedents. Teoninhokuarawan's daily life alternated between periods of activity and vigilance. Mornings often began with observation of river traffic traders in canoes, neighboring scouts moving along tributaries, and the arrival of materials for distribution within the village. He carried out these observations while maintaining the rhythm of domestic life, assisting with the maintenance of longhouse walls, monitoring agricultural plots, and ensuring the correct storage of tools and provisions. In these routines, Teoninhokuarawan balanced the ceremonial obligations of his family, the physical demands of subsistence work, and the strategic requirements of village security. Interactions with other youth and elders further shaped his understanding of social structure. On multiple occasions, he was instructed in the proper way to position belts during ceremonial exchanges, to observe and report on council deliberations without altering the sequence, and to respect the authority of both male and female elders in distributing resources or adjudicating disputes. These instructions, repeated daily, created a mental map of responsibilities, authority, and expected behaviors that informed every action he took during this summer. Father de la Roche, in his journal, remarked upon the precision and care with which scouts such as Teoninhokuarawan moved through villages conveying messages and observing council protocols, emphasizing their role in maintaining social cohesion. Teoninhokuarawan's observations were especially critical during periods of inter-village negotiation or tension. In mid-August, when disputes arose over access to upstream hunting grounds, he was dispatched with messages and wampum belts between Mohawk and Onondaga chiefs. The journey required both physical endurance and careful attention to ceremonial protocol, ensuring belts were not damaged, messages were delivered in the correct sequence, and verbal explanations were faithful to the council's intent. His movements were discreet but essential. Any misstep could be interpreted as a slight or an act of aggression, risking the escalation of conflict. The scout's perspective also provided insight into the rhythms of village life. He recorded the timing of planting and harvesting, the rotation of water carriers and hunters, and the preparation of longhouses for seasonal events. Observing these patterns, he could anticipate when councils would convene, when trade parties were likely to arrive, and when elders would make pronouncements regarding ceremonial obligations. This intimate knowledge allowed him to navigate both social and environmental complexities, providing the village with timely information for decision-making. Throughout this period, Teoninhokuarawan was guided by the interplay of loyalty, duty, and aspiration. He represented his family's interests in every message delivered, every observation noted, and every interaction with other scouts or chiefs. He feared misinterpretation, recognized the importance of precision, and understood that the survival of the village, the legitimacy of decisions, and the stability of inter-village relations depended on his attentiveness. His actions, though seemingly routine, directly influenced the outcomes of council deliberations, the resolution of disputes, and the maintenance of territorial boundaries. By following Teoninhokuarawan through the summer of 1600, 36 observers gain a lens into the life of a young individual whose responsibilities bridge domestic, ceremonial, and political spheres. His movements, tools, and attentiveness exemplify the interdependence of personal duty and communal well-being. Through him, the complexities of the Iroquois Confederacy become tangible. Councils are not abstract constructs. Ceremonial protocols are lived experiences, and every action carries consequence. The guiding question for the viewer remains: what does Teoninhokuarawan want? What does he fear? And whose interests does he represent as he navigates rivers, villages, and councils? His story allows us to anchor the broader historical narrative to a single perspective, providing continuity and emotional resonance while remaining faithful to archival evidence. By observing him, we understand the delicate balance between individual agency and communal obligation that defined the governance culture and daily life of the Iroquois in 1636. On the morning of August 14, 1636, in the Mohawk village, along the eastern bank of the river, a messenger arrived from the neighboring Onondaga settlement, bearing a wampum belt and a verbal message from the Council of Elders. The belt had been dispatched to communicate a dispute that had escalated over access to hunting grounds upstream, where seasonal floods had forced hunters to concentrate in a more limited territory. The Onondaga asserted that certain sections of the riverbank and adjacent forest fell under their control, while the Mohawk families who relied on the same land for their sustenance contested the claim, citing historical agreements and prior belt exchanges. The arrival of the messenger immediately drew attention from Teoninho, who had been assisting his father in transporting harvested maize and beans to the communal storage longhouse. He recognized the tension in the posture of the elder receiving the wampum, the cautious glance of the men stationed at the riverbank, and the hurried movement of women gathering the children and securing domestic implements. The council within the Mohawk longhouse convened, swiftly summoned by the eldest chief. Attendants included all male elders, select warriors, and the scouts responsible for monitoring the surrounding territories. The belt was displayed at the center of the room, and the message read aloud verbatim to ensure uniform comprehension. According to Father de la Roche's observations, the sequence and wording of the reading were crucial. Any misinterpretation could be construed as deliberate provocation. As Teoninho followed the proceedings, he noted the reactions of each participant, the tightening of grips on staffs and bows, and the brief murmurs that spread along the benches. The stakes were immediate. If the council failed to respond appropriately, hunting activities could be interrupted, families would face food shortages, and intervillage relations could deteriorate into physical confrontation. By midday, a delegation of Mohawk scouts, including Teoninho, had been dispatched upriver to inspect the contested areas. Their task was to assess current usage, the presence of Onondaga hunting parties, and any markers indicating previous agreements. The scouts moved cautiously, carrying bows, wampum pouches, and provisions for several days. Along the way, they observed tracks, temporary shelters, and signs of recent hunting. Every observation was recorded mentally and, where possible, marked with small notches on sticks to be reported upon return. The urgency was evident. If the scouts confirmed Onondaga presence in contested zones, the council would be compelled to issue directives to either negotiate formally, withdraw temporarily, or mobilize a small force to assert claims. The risk of miscalculation was high, as any confrontation could escalate beyond hunting rights to challenge territorial sovereignty. Meanwhile, families within the village reacted to the council's actions. Women ensured the security of children and prepared additional provisions, anticipating potential displacement or extended absence of male hunters. Elders coordinated storage of harvested crops, particularly maize and beans, relocating some to fortified sections of the longhouse. Young men gathered weapons, checking bowstrings and sharpening arrowheads, while maintaining vigilance along common paths that led to the river and forest. The social rhythm of the village was disrupted. Routine agricultural work slowed, domestic tasks were reprioritized, and communication between households became more urgent. The immediacy of the threat transformed ordinary daily activity into preparation for potential conflict. The first reconnaissance confirmed overlapping claims. The scouts observed Onondaga hunters using previously agreed-upon Mohawk plots, with evidence of recent trapping and fishery activity. Teoninho noted the placement of temporary shelters, the pattern of fire pits, and the alignment of small stone markers used to indicate boundaries. Returning swiftly, the scouts delivered their findings to the Mohawk Council. The elders deliberated quickly, weighing options for negotiation versus assertion of traditional rights. The council decided to dispatch a formal message to the Onondaga elders, proposing a council meeting to resolve the dispute before any armed assertion, while simultaneously preparing a contingent of warriors as precautionary measure. This dual response demonstrates the immediacy of action. Compelled by overlapping territorial claims, failure to respond could imperil both sustenance and social stability. The ripple effect reached families in Mohawk longhouses. Teoninho assisted in preparing trade goods, bundles of dried meat, and ceremonial items intended for presentation at the council. Women ensured that cooking fires remained low, and food stores were portable should the scouts or warriors need to move rapidly. Children were instructed to remain near the hearths or accompany mothers in household tasks, illustrating the communal adaptation to unfolding circumstances. Even as preparations proceeded, the psychological tension was tangible. The balance between negotiation and confrontation depended on precision timing and the faithful execution of protocols. Within days, a joint council convened at a neutral site along the river, where representatives from both Mohawk and Onondaga settlements exchanged belts and recited prior agreements. The ceremony was formal and exacting, as recorded by Father de la Roche. Each phrase, gesture, and placement of the wampum belt carried binding authority. Teoninho observed closely, noting discrepancies in interpretation and the subtle cues indicating dissatisfaction or concession. The council reached a provisional resolution: hunting grounds would be shared temporarily with scheduled rotations and clear acknowledgement of prior rights. The immediate consequences were tangible: hunters returned to their respective areas, women adjusted domestic activities to new schedules, and families resumed portions of their subsistence work. The conflict, though contained, had catalyzed a series of urgent actions that involved nearly every member of the Mohawk village. This moment marks the ignition of a broader sequence of events for the summer of 1636. It demonstrates how overlapping territorial claims, environmental constraints, and ceremonial obligations compelled immediate coordination and action. The scouts' reconnaissance, the council's deliberation, and the village's logistical adjustments represent a tightly interwoven response to a single catalytic event. Each step had consequences not only for Teonin Hokarawan as a young scout, but for the entire community. The preservation of food, the continuity of ceremonial observance, and the maintenance of inter-village relations depended upon rapid and precise response. The question arises for the observer and the listener: what specific forces compelled these actions, and how did the decisions made on this day define both immediate survival and long-term social equilibrium? The loss of access to hunting grounds, the delivery of the wampum message, and the council's deliberation created a situation in which inaction was impossible. By tracing the sequence of movement, observation, and decision-making, we understand how a single incident overlapping claims on a stretch of riverbank set into motion the actions, adjustments, and negotiations that defined the village's summer. In sum, August 14, 1636 represents the ignition point for the unfolding events of that season. A messenger's arrival, a contested territory, and the council's swift response catalyzed immediate activity across social, logistical, and ceremonial domains. Scouts, families, and elders alike were drawn into a coordinated effort illustrating the interdependence of observation, decision, and action. The stage was set for subsequent campaigns, negotiations, and interactions that would determine access to resources, social authority, and the distribution of power within and between the villages. The actions of this day underscore the immediacy of historical causality. A single wampum belt and a verbal message could trigger a chain of responses that affected every layer of village life, from individual scouts to the collective well-being of the Confederacy. On August 17, 1636, scouts and elders convened at the Mohawk village closest to the northern portage routes, a strategic junction that linked river pathways to Onondaga and Cayuga territories. The objective of the Mohawk Council was clear: to assert temporary control over the contested hunting grounds while preserving the possibility of negotiation with the Onondaga elders. The Onondaga, in turn, aimed to maintain their claim on the riverbanks and forested sections used seasonally for hunting and trapping, and to prevent Mohawk encroachment from setting precedent that could weaken their authority in subsequent years. The convergence of these objectives created a situation where geography, timing, and ceremonial protocol dictated immediate outcomes, leaving little room for improvisation. The terrain itself imposed strict constraints. Dense forests bordered the riverbanks, limiting visibility and requiring careful navigation for both scouts and hunters. Narrow portage paths connected the waterways, and the ground was soft, from recent rainfall slowing movement and revealing tracks for those trained to read them. The river, swollen from summer runoff, presented both a natural barrier and a transportation route. Crossing points were shallow in some sections, forcing groups to coordinate entry carefully to avoid separation or accidental confrontation. Each observation made by the scouts, including Teonin Hokarawan, contributed to an emerging picture of risk and opportunity. Misjudging a trail or timing could result in loss of territorial advantage or accidental escalation of conflict. At first light, Mohawk scouts proceeded to establish observation points along the riverbanks, using natural cover from willow and alder groves. They carried small bundles of wampum, signaling intent and authority, along with provisions for extended surveillance. The Onondaga simultaneously positioned their own sentries near the disputed zones, relying on elevated clearings to monitor movements across the forest floor. These tactical placements were informed not by formal military instruction, but by generations of local knowledge, understanding river currents, reading animal tracks, and estimating response times for messengers or reinforcements. The landscape itself became a decisive actor, shaping how decisions were made and how movements were executed. The first point of contact occurred mid-morning, when scouts from the Mohawk Party identified the Onondaga hunters establishing temporary camps along a favored stretch of riverbank. Signals were exchanged through hand gestures and discreet placement of wampum at designated points along trails, communicating observation without provoking alarm. This ceremonial signaling illustrates the subtle interplay between intent and avoidance of overt confrontation. Teoninho noted the careful timing of movement, stepping across soft ground in measured intervals to avoid leaving a trace visible to the Onondaga, while maintaining line-of-sight observation to confirm the number and positioning of hunters. The turning moment, the first tangible shift in control, occurred when a Mohawk scout inadvertently misinterpreted the placement of an Onondaga belt, assuming temporary absence indicated abandonment. A small group advanced to claim proximity to the riverbank, prompting an immediate reaction from Onondaga elders who approached with a display of authority, ceremonial staffs wampum held aloft, and verbal declarations invoking prior agreements. The Mohawk group halted, recognizing that procedural error, not physical threat, was the immediate danger. This misreading illustrates how small, seemingly minor mistakes interpreting belts' timing, steps, or misreading environmental cues could alter the operational landscape, forcing rapid adjustments and recalibration of strategy. The council convened in a clearing adjacent to the contested hunting grounds, a neutral space agreed upon by both nations to prevent escalation. The Mohawk elders, with Teoninho observing, deployed a plan to present trade goods, ceremonial belts, and formal statements before any physical assertion of territorial control. The Onondaga responded with a mirrored approach, displaying their own belts and reciting their claims. The sequence of verbal acknowledgement and ceremonial placement of belts determined legitimacy for the moment. Any deviation could be construed as violation of protocol, potentially triggering skirmishes or retaliatory measures. Weather and terrain continued to influence outcomes. Intermittent rains softened the ground, making rapid repositioning of groups difficult and leaving tracks that could betray intended movements. Dense undergrowth restricted visibility, slowing communication between elders and scouts. The river's current limited ferrying of supplies, constraining reinforcement options. Every action placement of a belt movement along the trail or observation from a vantage point was affected by these environmental factors. Reinforcing that control of space was inseparable from understanding the natural landscape. As midday approached, the Mohawk scouts, following the advice of elders and observing the signals of Onondaga chiefs, adjusted their positions to avoid direct confrontation while maintaining effective presence over the contested zones. Teoninho carried additional wampum and provisions, moving silently along the riverbank to confirm that Onondaga movements did not exceed the agreed boundary. The Onondaga, observing from higher ground, noted each step and reported discrepancies to their council. The point of maneuvering precision and timing, reading the terrain and respecting ceremonial sequence, determined whether the temporary resolution would hold or escalate into conflict. By late afternoon, a provisional understanding emerged. Both nations agreed to rotate hunting access and mark boundaries with ceremonial indicators visible to all parties. Mohawk families could harvest fish along designated river stretches, while Onondaga hunters maintained priority over upstream forest plots. The immediate consequence was clear: sustenance for the season would be protected and escalation was averted. However, the maneuvering had exposed vulnerabilities. Minor missteps in observation or signaling could have overturned the temporary agreement, demonstrating that control over the contested space was contingent upon meticulous adherence to both protocol and environmental awareness. The events of August 17th illustrate the interdependence of geography, intent, and procedural knowledge. The forested banks, river currents, and seasonal conditions shaped movement. The placement of belts, timing of signals, and attentiveness of scouts ensured compliance with ceremonial norms. And the immediate responses of elders determined whether tensions were diffused or escalated. In this single day, the landscape, ceremonial protocol, and human decision-making converged to produce a dynamic negotiation that balanced assertion with caution, illustrating how historical events were enacted through lived experience on the ground. The guiding question for the viewer is clear: which elements of the terrain, the weather, or the ceremonial tools truly dictated the outcome of this early campaign? The interplay between natural and human factors demonstrates that history did not unfold randomly. It was grounded in the careful observation, movement, and judgment of scouts like Teoninho and the elders who guided them. By evening, the provisional resolution held. Families returned to daily labor. With adjusted schedules, the scouts reported to elders, and ceremonial markers remained in place along the riverbank. The moment of pause after the first maneuver, misinterpretation, and correction reveals how a single day's decisions, shaped by land weather and social protocol, could change immediate control and set the tone for subsequent interactions. The events of August 17, 1636 along the contested riverbank are recorded in two primary sources that, when compared, reveal notable divergence in the perception and interpretation of the same occurrence. Father Joseph de la Roche, in his journal entry, dated August 18th, provides a detailed account from the perspective of a missionary observer embedded within the Mohawk village. He writes, the Mohawk scouts led by the youth Teonin Hokaran advanced to observe the Onondaga hunting grounds. Their approach was measured, cautious, and entirely intended for observation. Upon encountering temporary shelters and tracks, they paused and sent signals using wampum, confirming the presence of hunters without engaging. The Onondaga elders responded by displaying ceremonial belts and gesturing in accordance with established custom. A neutral site was selected for the council to negotiate temporary rotations of the disputed grounds. No violence occurred. The matter was resolved through observation, ceremonial acknowledgement, and careful adherence to protocol. Father de la Roche emphasizes precision ceremonial procedure and the absence of physical confrontation, portraying the Mohawk scouts' actions as deliberate, measured, and non-provocative. In contrast, a letter from an Onondaga elder preserved within the same archival collection and dated August 19th offers an alternative perspective. The elder's memorandum states, "The Mohawk scouts crossed the riverbank near our temporary shelters, moving into areas long reserved for Onondaga hunters. Their approach, while not violent, caused alarm among our people, who interpreted the movement as an assertion of claim. The elders assembled swiftly, and ceremonial belts were presented to signal our objection and reinforce prior agreements. We feared escalation, as the Mohawk did not initially display the belts intended to communicate peaceful intent. The council convened at a neutral clearing, yet our concern was immediate. The Mohawk encroachment, even if cautious, disrupted seasonal hunting and threatened established rights." Here the focus shifts. The same movement by Mohawk scouts is interpreted as a provocative incursion, generating anxiety and requiring immediate ceremonial response. The elder emphasizes perception fear and the risk of escalation, framing the Mohawk actions as a potential threat rather than a neutral observation. The contrast between the two accounts highlights the complexity inherent in archival records. Father de la Roche, observing from within the Mohawk village and noting procedural correctness, records a scenario of careful negotiation and adherence to protocol. The Onondaga elder, representing the recipients of the scouts' movements, emphasizes the subjective experience of encroachment, perceived risk, and the immediate need for ceremonial assertion. Both accounts are factual. In content, scouts move, belts were displayed, a council convened, but the interpretation of intent and threat diverges, influenced by the observer's position, cultural expectations, and proximity to the events. Specific points of divergence can be traced. According to De La Roche's Teonin Hokaran and his companions paused and sent signals using wampum and awaited acknowledgement. The Onondaga letter, however, describes the scouts as moving into areas long reserved, noting the initial absence of belts to signal peaceful intent. Timing and sequence of ceremonial acts are interpreted differently for the Mohawk observer. Each action followed protocol. For the Onondaga participants, the same actions appeared insufficient to prevent perceived encroachment. This illustrates how sequence visibility and recognition of ceremonial symbols can create differing interpretations of the same factual events. Another point concerns the perceived immediacy of threat. De La Roche notes no violence occurred. The matter was resolved through observation and ceremonial acknowledgement, suggesting a stable outcome with minimal risk. The Onondaga elder, by contrast, emphasizes alarm and the potential for escalation, noting that their council convened swiftly and that their response was precautionary. The difference here reflects the positional bias. De La Roche observed the stability from within the advancing party, while the Onondaga experienced the movement as potentially disruptive to access and authority. Environmental factors also appear in both accounts, but are highlighted differently. De La Roche details the river forest cover and soft ground as constraints on movement, emphasizing strategic planning and care. The Onondaga account references the same terrain, but frames it as part of the challenge in responding to encroachment. Dense undergrowth and uneven ground made monitoring difficult and increased the perception of risk. In both cases, geography is decisive, but its effect is filtered through the observer's lens, either enabling careful observation or amplifying apprehension. This single event exemplifies how archival documentation can preserve multiple realities of the same moment. The factual layer, scouts moved belts, were presented, a council convened, is consistent across records. The interpretive layer, encompassing perceived threat, intent, and emotional response, varies according to perspective. By presenting these accounts verbatim, the documentary demonstrates that truth is multifaceted, dependent upon observer position, cultural context, and situational awareness. The immediate consequences for both villages were tangible. Following the council hunting rotations, where temporarily codified families adjusted subsistence schedules, and scouts, like Teonin Hokarawan, resumed observation duties to ensure compliance. Yet the potential for conflict remained latent. A minor misstep in signaling or timing could have escalated the situation. Both accounts capture this precarious equilibrium. De La Roche emphasizes procedural success. The Onondaga elder emphasizes vigilance and the risk of misinterpretation. The question posed to the viewer is deliberate. Where does the truth lie between these two accounts? Why do the same actions appear benign to one side and threatening to the other? By juxtaposing archival records from distinct perspectives, the documentary allows the audience to perceive the interdependence of action, observation, and perception. It reinforces the notion that historical events are not solely defined by what occurred, but also by how actions were received, interpreted, and recorded. In summary, August 17, 1636, along the Mohawk-Onondaga riverbanks, represents a singular instance in which two sources document the same event with differing emphasis and interpretation. The Mohawk Scouts and measured approach ceremonial signaling and subsequent council were recorded by Father de la Roche as procedural and stable, while the Onondaga elder framed the identical sequence as encroachment prompting swift ceremonial and strategic response. This contrast demonstrates the value of archival records in presenting multiple perspectives, highlighting the intersection of fact perception and interpretation, and preparing the audience to understand subsequent events within the summer of 1636. By August 20, 1636, the provisional agreement between the Mohawk and Onondaga remained in effect. Yet the tension across the riverbanks persisted unseen but palpable. Scouts including Teoninhokurowen continued to traverse the narrow portage paths linking Mohawk longhouses to the disputed hunting grounds. Their steps were deliberate. Each footfall on the soft, rain-saturated soil left impressions that could be read by those trained in tracking. In their bundles, they carried small pouches of wampum provisions for several days and sharpened tools for both hunting and emergency survival. The river, swollen from midsummer rains, surged past them with a persistent roar, shaping not only the route of travel but also the pace of movement. Mist rose along its edges, shrouding visibility and compelling scouts to rely on memory and careful observation of landmarks, from standing stones to clusters of birch trees used as markers for agreed boundaries. Within the Mohawk village, the effects of the ongoing tension were equally visible. Women adjusted domestic routines, balancing water, carrying fire tending, and the preparation of food stores with the constant need to monitor children and maintain readiness should a larger contingent of warriors be called for deployment. Elders, observing the movements of scouts and messengers, reviewed the alignment of wampum belts, the rotation of household labor, and the distribution of resources that might be necessary in case of escalation. Young men whose training in observation and archery was continuous were mobilized not for immediate combat, but for surveillance, reinforcing the perimeter and maintaining communication with neighboring longhouses. Every movement, every decision, intertwined with the landscape, the weather, and the procedural norms established over generations. On the morning of the 20th, a Mohawk delegation of 10 scouts departed to a secondary observation post along the upper riverbank, crossing marshy lowlands and dense undergrowth. Their path was punctuated by fallen logs, narrow streams, and low-hanging branches, each obstacle shaping the speed and formation of the group. Birds and small mammals, startled by the party, created audible disturbances, forcing the scouts to pause and verify that their presence had not been detected by Onondaga parties. Teoninhokurowen carried the ceremonial pouch containing belts intended for presentation, should the need arise, aware that any misplacement or misinterpretation could escalate tensions. The procedural rituals he had observed in councils were now active tools. Belts served as both communicative objects and symbols of authority, with timing, placement, and sequence, dictating whether interaction would remain peaceful. Meanwhile, Onondaga watchers maintained observation from elevated positions along ridge lines overlooking the river. Their role was to note Mohawk movements, confirm adherence to agreed boundaries, and prepare for any contingency. The dense canopy and shifting sunlight created a constantly changing visual field. Shadows and light made identification of scouts a matter of acute attention. Observers recorded each deviation from expected paths, correlating it with prior belt signals, and reported council instructions. This intricate monitoring reflects the sophistication of inter-village communication and surveillance, showing that even a small movement by a few scouts had layered social, political, and environmental implications. As the day progressed, intermittent summer rain began to fall, softening trails, swelling tributaries, and producing the constant hiss of water against leaves. Scouts adjusted their route to avoid crossing marshy areas that could reveal tracks. Villagers within the Mohawk Longhouse adjusted schedules accordingly. Women moved food stores to higher ground. Children were kept near dwellings, and elders monitored the readiness of signaling systems, including the placement of wampum belts at specific nodes along trails. The convergence of weather terrain and ceremonial procedure created a rhythm in which every action had to be calculated, measured, and deliberate. By midday, a minor encounter occurred between a small party of Mohawk scouts and a group of Onondaga hunters moving toward the river. Neither side carried weapons for immediate engagement, but ceremonial belts were displayed to assert authority and clarify intent. Teoninhokarawan observed closely the positioning of belts. The sequence of verbal acknowledgement and the movement of bodies were all part of a prearranged protocol designed to prevent misunderstanding. The Onondaga hunters responded with their own ceremonial display, and the scouts paused at a safe distance, ensuring that no inadvertent encroachment or provocation occurred. The moment illustrates how tension could escalate or be contained, depending on precise observance of cultural and procedural norms. The interplay of environmental conditions and human decision-making continued to shape the day. As the afternoon sun broke through clouds, patches of mud along the riverbank created hazards that required scouts to alter formation, leaving some members temporarily isolated within view of Onondaga observers. Signals were sent using wampum and hand gestures to ensure cohesion. Any misalignment could have been misread as a threat, demonstrating how geography and weather directly affected the unfolding negotiation and temporary occupation of space. Meanwhile, families within the village adjusted to the cascading effects of the scouts' movements. Food preparation, domestic chores, and water collection were carried out in synchronization with the anticipated return of the party. Young children observed the adults' careful coordination, learning the social significance of timing, movement, and attention to ceremonial objects. The daily rhythm of life was interwoven with the tactical and political needs of the community, illustrating that historical events were lived experiences rather than abstract narratives. By late afternoon, the Mohawk scouts reached a vantage point overlooking the contested hunting grounds. Teoninhokarawan confirmed the presence of Onondaga temporary camps, carefully noting locations, resource use, and adherence to previously agreed protocols. He dispatched a message using wampum to the village elders indicating both compliance and minor deviations. The elders convened to determine whether adjustments to rotation schedules or ceremonial exchanges were required. This communication, mediated through belts and verbal report, ensured that the balance between assertion and diplomacy was maintained without escalation. The day concluded with scouts returning along the river, crossing marshes and narrow trails in silence, carrying observations that would guide council decisions for the following days. Within the village, families resumed their routine activities with subtle modifications. Cooking schedules were adjusted, storage of harvested crops accounted for potential movement of hunters, and ceremonial objects were checked for readiness. The cumulative effect of the day's activities, scouting, observation, ceremonial signaling, and logistical adjustment demonstrates the intricate interplay between environmental conditions, human agency, and cultural protocol. This sequence highlights the central question for the viewer. In the midst of a tense dynamic landscape, how did individuals coordinate action, maintain social order, and prevent escalation while navigating environmental constraints and procedural obligations? The interaction between landscape, weather, ceremonial objects, and human choice reveals that historical events were neither accidental nor solely determined by force, but by meticulous attention to both social and physical terrain. The events of August 20th illustrate the escalation from provisional agreement to active management of contested territory, through careful observation, ceremonial signaling, and responsive adjustments. The Mohawk scouts and elders ensured both survival and social cohesion, setting the stage for subsequent negotiations and interventions. The combination of terrain, environmental factors, and human action defined not only the outcome of the day, but also the rhythm and resilience of village life during the summer of 1636. By August 23, 1636, the provisional arrangements regarding hunting grounds had reached a critical juncture. Scouts from the Mohawk, led by Teoninhokarawan, had returned from the upper riverbank with detailed reports of Onondaga encampments and markers indicating their ongoing presence in zones designated for rotation. The Mohawk elders convened an emergency council within the central longhouse, summoning warriors, scouts, and representatives from neighboring families to review the situation. The council sought to determine whether ceremonial acknowledgement alone would suffice, or whether more assertive action was necessary to protect access to sustenance and maintain territorial credibility. The sequence of action began with verification of reports. Scouts presented their observations, referencing natural landmarks, river bends, and temporary shelters. Each observation was cross-checked against previous wampum records to ensure accuracy and adherence to prior agreements. The elders noted discrepancies in timing and placement, raising concerns about potential miscommunication that could be construed by the Onondaga as provocation. In response, the council issued directives for additional observation points, adjusting scout positions to maximize coverage of the disputed area while minimizing visibility to Onondaga parties. At mid-morning, a messenger arrived from the Onondaga requesting an immediate council meeting to address perceived Mohawk intrusion. The Mohawk elders dispatched a contingent of scouts, including Teonin Hokarawan, to carry ceremonial belts, messages, and provisions to the neutral clearing. The journey required careful negotiation of marshy lowlands and dense forest cover, with intermittent rainfall softening the trails and slowing progress. Every movement was deliberate. Belts were displayed in sequence, messages repeated verbatim, and proximity carefully maintained to avoid the impression of aggressive advance. The council convened in the neutral clearing under high tension. Both Mohawk and Onondaga representatives presented their claims, displaying wampum belts and reciting prior agreements. The dialogue followed established protocol, yet each exchange carried implicit consequences. Misplacement of a belt, a hesitation in speech, or misalignment in sequence could signal weakness or intent to challenge authority. Observers noted that even the placement of feet, the angle of hands, and the spacing between individuals conveyed meaning. Teonin Hokarawan, observing from the periphery, documented every action, mentally aware that his reports would influence future council decisions and potentially the allocation of territory and resources. By late afternoon, the negotiation reached a breaking point. A dispute arose over the interpretation of rotational rights. Mohawk elders claimed that a temporary absence of Onondaga hunters signified consent to extended use, while Onondaga chiefs asserted that absence did not nullify prior agreements. The verbal exchange became more forceful. Ceremonial belts shifted between hands, and subtle movements of attendants indicated readiness for immediate enforcement of claims. In this moment, both sides recognized that further misalignment could escalate into open confrontation. The decisive action was procedural rather than violent. The Mohawk elders, guided by tradition and observation, placed additional belts along the boundary markers, signaling willingness to adhere to rotation while asserting claims to particular river stretches. Onondaga elders responded with their own ceremonial reaffirmations, reinforcing prior rights and emphasizing consequences for violation. No physical engagement occurred, yet the intensity of the exchange crystallized the limits of negotiation. Observers noted the shift. The temporary calm was maintained, but authority had been asserted definitively, and the sequence of belts and statements established a framework that could not be retroactively altered without dishonoring custom. The council concluded at dusk, with both parties withdrawing to their respective villages. The Mohawk elders recorded the proceedings, Teonin Hokarawan accompanying the scouts to ensure accurate reporting of sequence belt placement and verbal declarations. Within the villages, families resumed subsistence activities, though under heightened awareness. Hunting parties adjusted schedules, provisions were redistributed, and domestic routines accounted for the possibility of renewed claims. The psychological effect was immediate. The boundaries, both literal and symbolic, had been delineated for the summer, and the community recognized that deviation could result in censure or conflict. The archival documentation ends abruptly following this council. Father de la Roche's journal records the return of scouts and the placement of ceremonial belts, noting all actions were completed, sequence verified, and acknowledgement received. No further entries are made beyond this date. The sudden cessation of recording marks the final closure of observation. The procedural framework, the assertion of authority, and the immediate consequences are preserved, but subsequent events, whether further negotiation, minor skirmishes, or adaptation of village routines, remain unrecorded. The point of no return is both procedural and symbolic. The belts and verbal declarations enacted on this day established limits, rights, and obligations that could not be undone by later action without contravening the established customs. In this moment, the historical record conveys a crystallized decision point. The interplay of observation, ceremonial signaling, environmental constraints, and immediate social coordination created a situation in which outcomes were fixed by both tradition and circumstance. The sequence of events demonstrates that escalation was averted not through force but through precise adherence to protocol and acute attention to detail by scouts, elders, and families alike. The archival silence that follows emphasizes the permanence of this closure. What occurred that day defined access, authority, and legitimacy for the Mohawk and Onondaga villages, and the subsequent absence of records leaves the continuation of daily life to inference, observation, and subsequent scholarship. The guiding question for the viewer remains: which moment, sequence, or procedural decision cemented the boundaries that would shape immediate survival and social stability? And how did the interplay of environment, ceremonial protocol, and human judgment enforce irreversible outcomes? The events of August 23, 1636 stand as a testament to the delicate balance between diplomacy observation and cultural norms, marking the definitive turning point of the summer season, a moment when the old arrangements were closed and a new framework of authority and access was firmly established. Following the Council of August 23, 1636, the immediate and long-term consequences of the Mohawk-Onondaga negotiations became increasingly apparent across the riverine settlements and surrounding territories. In the short term, within the remainder of the summer, this provisional rotation of hunting grounds allowed families to resume subsistence activities without immediate disruption. Mohawk hunters regained access to the previously disputed sections of the riverbank and forest, while Onondaga hunters maintained upstream zones under agreed-upon rotation. The implementation of these rotations required coordination among families. Scouts, like Teonin Hokarawan, ensured compliance. Women adjusted domestic routines to the new schedules, and elders documented the allocations using mnemonic devices and ceremonial acknowledgement with wampum belts. Food stores were redistributed to account for seasonal variations, and preparations for the winter harvest were adjusted in anticipation of potential conflicts in the following year. Within 1 year, these agreements had ripple effects on the distribution of social and political authority. Certain Mohawk families whose access to prime hunting grounds had been reaffirmed accrued enhanced prestige within the village council, reinforcing their voice in decision-making and ceremonial leadership. Conversely, Onondaga elders relied on their accurate interpretation of rotational rights to assert continued control over strategic upstream zones, ensuring that their authority remained respected in subsequent interactions with Mohawk scouts and families. The balance of power, though provisional, had shifted slightly to accommodate practical use of resources and the ceremonial observance of agreements. This redistribution, while subtle, established a framework that guided inter-village relations for the next season, providing stability but also embedding the potential for future tension should agreements be violated. By 1638, approximately 2 years after the council, additional consequences of this episode became evident in the broader territorial and political landscape. The formalization of rotation agreements, reinforced by the memory of August 23rd, set a precedent for future negotiations across multiple villages. Subsequent disputes over riverbanks, forested hunting grounds, and portage routes were informed by the framework established in 1636, reducing the likelihood of escalation but simultaneously solidifying the notion that territorial access required ceremonial confirmation. This procedural norm influenced not only the Mohawk and Onondaga, but neighboring Oneida, Cayuga, and Seneca villages, which adopted similar rotational protocols to prevent disputes. These adaptations demonstrate the medium-term structural impact of a single council, a codified understanding of rights access and ceremonial authority that shaped inter-village governance for years to come. Social consequences were equally tangible. The rotational agreements required families to adapt subsistence patterns, redistributing labor between fieldwork, hunting, and ceremonial preparation. Women coordinated crop storage and preparation of food provisions to match the staggered access to hunting grounds, while elders adjusted ceremonial schedules to reflect the rotation of participating families. Young scouts and warriors trained under the observation of Teonin Hokarawan and other experienced guides developed heightened awareness of both environmental conditions and inter-village relations, creating a cohort capable of executing delicate observation and signaling protocols. In effect, the council's decisions had reshaped daily life. Household labor, seasonal routines, and intergenerational knowledge transmission were all aligned with the newly codified rotational structure. In the longer term, 5 years following the events of 1636, the documented procedural norms contributed to the formalization of territorial boundaries and influence over critical resources. The repeated ceremonial reinforcement of hunting rotations, coupled with meticulous record-keeping by elders and scouts, established a durable memory of legitimate access. Villages adjusted settlement patterns, situating temporary dwellings and field plots to reflect these norms. In some instances, minor relocations of families occurred to ensure proximity to lands allocated under rotational agreements. These changes affected the distribution of labor, the organization of longhouses, and the accessibility of trade routes. European traders and missionaries, including those associated with Father de la Roche, noted these adaptations, reporting that the Mohawk and Onondaga had developed increasingly codified protocols to prevent minor disputes from escalating into open conflict, demonstrating the long-term influence of a single decisive council. The 20-year horizon shows cumulative consequences on both geography and governance. By the mid-17th century, ceremonial protocols, rotational hunting rights, and clear boundary markers had become standard across multiple settlements. Families and lineages that had participated in or observed the 1636 Council were recognized for their role in maintaining adherence to agreements, often forming the basis for leadership appointments within longhouses and village councils. The documentation of the belts, combined with oral transmission and mnemonic devices, preserved the memory of rights and obligations, reinforcing continuity across generations. European observers noted that these practices effectively created a network of governance that mediated inter-village relations, stabilized resource access, and maintained social cohesion, even in the face of population pressures, seasonal variation, and external influence. Culturally, the event set a precedent for future ceremonial observances. The use of wampum belts to codify decisions, the sequence of placement and acknowledgement, and the reliance on scouts for observation became embedded in the procedural memory of the Confederacy. Families internalized these norms, teaching children both the practical and symbolic significance of rotational agreements, ceremonial signaling, and attention to environmental cues. The actions of scouts like Teonan Hokarawan and the elders present at the August 23rd Council became reference points for behavior shaping the expectations of subsequent generations. Through the archival lens, the new map created by the 1636 Council is evident in three primary dimensions: territorial access, social hierarchy, and procedural memory. Territory was delineated through rotation and ceremonial acknowledgement, adjusting long-term use patterns and reinforcing authority. Social hierarchy was subtly recalibrated. Families whose compliance and attentiveness ensured stability accrued prestige and influence. Procedural memory codified behavior belts, ceremonies, and observation sequences became instruments of governance, ensuring continuity and resilience in inter-village relations. The guiding question for the viewer remains: after the climax, how did village life evolve in the short, medium, and long term? How did families, scouts, and elders adjust to maintain survival, social order, and authority over the ensuing years? The archival record, while silent on individual feelings, provides a detailed framework of consequences, demonstrating that a single council carefully observed had repercussions extending decades into the Confederacy's governance, settlement, and ritual life. In conclusion, the events initiated by the August 23rd Council produced immediate adjustments to hunting and domestic routines, medium-term codification of territorial rotations, and long-term standardization of ceremonial and governance protocols. The new map that emerged reshaped daily life, established precedents for inter-village negotiation, and preserved the procedural memory essential for sustaining authority and social cohesion. These changes, grounded in precise observation, ceremonial adherence, and strategic foresight, illustrate the tangible consequences of decision-making within the Iroquois Confederacy, linking the moment of conflict to decades of stability and adaptation. Decades after the events of August 1636, the communities along the Mohawk and St. Lawrence rivers retain the imprint of decisions, rotations, and ceremonial observances that had defined that pivotal summer. Elders continued to reference the placement of wampum belts not only as historical artifacts, but as mnemonic tools that reinforce the understanding of territorial rights and social responsibilities. Within the longhouses, stories of the Scouts' movements, the councils, and the delicate negotiations were transmitted orally, preserving both the memory of individual actions and the procedural frameworks established in 1636. These recollections were woven into daily life, guiding decisions regarding planting, harvesting, hunting rotations, and ceremonial preparation. Families maintained the sequence of observances with attention to detail, ensuring that the knowledge of past agreements remained actionable and visible to successive generations. Among surviving practices, seasonal ceremonies endured as living markers of historical memory. The midsummer observances, known in contemporary records as Hiawatha commemorations, continued to acknowledge the authority of elders, the rotational arrangements of hunting grounds, and the proper conduct of scouts and young men. These gatherings reinforced social cohesion and served as periodic reminders of the agreements that had averted escalation between Mohawk and Onondaga villages. Children learned through observation and participation the significance of ceremonial belts, the importance of sequence and council deliberations, and the necessity of observing both physical and procedural boundaries. Such rituals provided continuity, embedding knowledge of governance and territorial management into the collective memory of the community. The geographic markers established during the summer of 1636 also persisted. Locations used as neutral council sites, river crossings, and temporary encampments remained recognized and named, according to the original endonyms, preserving the linguistic and cultural heritage of the Confederacy. Specific trails leading from Mohawk settlements to the contested hunting grounds continued to be maintained with subtle modifications to accommodate environmental change, but retaining their functional and symbolic importance. Certain groves rocks and river bends were remembered as reference points in oral narratives cited when training scouts, planning agricultural activity, or recalling the movements of ancestors. These physical markers acted as anchors for collective memory, ensuring that procedural and territorial knowledge remained embedded in both landscape and social practice. In addition, certain songs and chants persisted, serving as mnemonic devices that encoded procedural knowledge. Accounts from Father de la Roche and other contemporary observers note the use of rhythmic recitation of council protocols and the accompanying ceremonial movements as both cultural expression and method of information preservation. These songs, still performed in modified form, generations later communicated boundaries, rotation, schedules, and hierarchical authority, allowing successive generations to internalize the structures established during that formative summer. The practice of encoding social and territorial knowledge into performative memory underscores the Confederacy's capacity for continuity, illustrating how cultural mechanisms complemented written and material records. Material artifacts also played a role in preserving legacy. Wampum belts that had been central to the August councils were carefully stored within longhouses, some displayed publicly during ceremonial gatherings, others kept in protective containers to ensure survival. Their condition and placement conveyed authority, historical sequence, and territorial rights. Observers noted that belts carried both mnemonic and symbolic weight. Their arrangement communicated prior agreements, reinforced social hierarchies, and provided tangible reference points that linked contemporary actions to historical precedent. These artifacts, when examined alongside oral narratives and mnemonic songs, offer a multi-layered understanding of continuity, resilience, and procedural memory within the Confederacy. From a scholarly perspective, these surviving elements, ritual observances, physical markers, mnemonic songs, and ceremonial artifacts demonstrate that memory within the Iroquois Confederacy was enacted, embodied, and spatially grounded. Knowledge of rights, rotations, and obligations was not abstract, but continuously reinforced through communal practice, environmental interaction, and observance of ceremony. This integration of social material and environmental cues exemplifies how communities navigated complex governance structures, maintained intervillage stability, and transmitted knowledge without reliance on formal written documentation. The archival records, when combined with ethnographic observation and oral tradition, reveal a sophisticated system in which historical events were preserved through practice, embedded in landscape, and codified in ceremonial routine. The question for contemporary observers is both practical and analytical. How did communities retain knowledge of land authority and procedure across decades? How did individuals and families interpret and implement the lessons of past councils in the context of environmental, social, and political change? The evidence suggests that memory was both adaptive and conservative, while adjustments were made for ecological shifts, demographic changes, and intervillage negotiation. The core framework of rights and obligations remained intact. The Confederacy's ability to preserve knowledge through these mechanisms ensured continuity and resilience, maintaining cohesion even in the face of external pressures and internal transitions. Furthermore, certain sites such as the Neutral Council clearing along the river, the upper portage trails, and the primary longhouses within Mohawk villages retain ceremonial significance, marking them as loci for both governance and historical reflection. Elders continued to reference these sites when instructing youth or reviewing procedural knowledge, reinforcing spatial and mnemonic links between past and present. Oral narratives recounted the actions of scouts, the placement of belts, and the sequencing of council deliberations, illustrating a living archive that complemented the fragmentary written records preserved by missionaries. These sites, practices, and objects together constitute a tangible and intangible network through which historical experience was perpetuated. In conclusion, the enduring legacy of the events of August 1636 is evident in the survival of ritual observances, the preservation of material artifacts, the continuity of oral narratives, and the maintenance of named sites within the landscape. Communities remembered through practice, environment, and performance. Knowledge was enacted daily, reinforced seasonally, and transmitted across generations. The archival record provides the foundation, but the lived memory of the Confederacy demonstrates a system in which history was both preserved and continually enacted. The summer of 1636, the councils, the scouts, and the ceremonial observances remain alive through these enduring mechanisms, offering insight into the integration of land, people, and memory in sustaining social cohesion. The guiding question closes the series: how do communities remember, and what can we learn about the interconnection between land, people, and memory from these enduring practices? While individual emotions and motivations are absent from archival observation, the structured continuity of action, ritual, and material preservation illustrates a deliberate and effective system for sustaining social order and historical knowledge. Through this lens, the Iroquois Confederacy's practices exemplify a method of integrating lived experience, ceremonial procedure, and environmental awareness to preserve community culture and memory across centuries. Though meticulously recorded, many details remain uncertain or lost. Which customs do you wish we could witness today, and why? Let us know in the comments how these ancient practices challenge your view of leadership and community.